All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a great program entitled Tribal Entrepreneurship and the Ongoing Transformation of Tribal Economies, How to Drive Reservation Enterprise and Innovation Confirmation. My name is Danielle Finn. I am the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program Director, and I'm an assistant professor in residence. Part of the programming today is offered because of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program, which was started by a very generous gift from the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians in 2020. The mission of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program is to provide cutting-edge research and training on gaming, regulation, and governance for Indian nations, to prepare Native students to become future leaders, and to educate non-Native students in the legal, political, and cultural context of tribal gaming and governance. The William S. Boyd School of Law is an institution of professional learning dedicated to academic excellence and practical training, and through the program, we are committing to helping tribal nations use gaming to build a stronger future. And part of that is tying it to the field of business. And so we have with us today Professor Steve Light. Steve Light is a visiting professor of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program at the William S. Boyd School of Law. Steve teaches in guided research and writing in Indian gaming, current issues in tribal governance, law and leadership, and tribal sports betting. He is the faculty advisor to the UNLV Gaming Law Journal. Prior to his position, he was at the University of North Dakota. Steve co-founded the Institute for the Study of Tribal Gaming Law and Policy as the first ever academic institute in the United States dedicated to tribal gaming. And recently, he was named Chester Fritz Distinguished Professor at the University of North Dakota, which is their highest honor. Professor Light has testified before the U.S. Senate Committee of Indian Affairs, and alongside with Professor Catherine Rand, he has authored more than 75 publications and 3 books on tribal gaming, recognized as the highest standards in the field. So today we're very happy to have Professor Steve Light moderate this panel. So Professor Light, take it away.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you for your excellent service as the Executive Director of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program. It is my pleasure to be joining all of you today. We have a spectacular group of folks that are attending today. We have spectacular panelists who are well informed, and I just want to express my thanks and my gratitude to all the terrific folks at the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program, and for the generous support of the San Manuel Band, as well as the Boyd School of Law, and for our panelists in advance today. It's just really exciting. And Danielle, thank you so much also for that generous introduction. And also a special thanks to Steve Isaacs, who's with us today. As a proud graduate of Boyd School of Law and the coordinator for our program, he's done a terrific job in helping to set up our panel for us today. So with that, we want to get to the program and to hear from some terrific panelists. And so first of all, as we're getting started, Steve Isaacs, is there any housekeeping that we need to do in relation to requirements or materials or contact or anything? I want to be sure that we hit that now. So in anticipation of making sure if we have to cover it again at the end, we will. But anything that we need to know?
I think just that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on the INGG program's YouTube page in sometime within the next week. We'll be making a post on our social media channels to notify everybody when it will be posted. So if you don't have the information for the INGG program, our social media channels, when I turn my camera off, there'll be a QR code. If you just scan that, it'll go to our link tree where all of our information is there. And also this has been approved for a Nevada General MCLE credit. And when you registered, you should have been given an option to put your Nevada state bar number. If you forgot or it didn't go through, please email me. You can probably find the email on the website, or it's ingg@unlv.edu. And I think that's pretty much it.
That's fantastic. Much appreciated to get that info in advance. And also we want to note that Steve will be shortly, we'll be launching a brief poll, and by poll, we just mean one question. We, the panelists, and we, the members of the program, are curious about your roles and responsibilities and what you see yourself doing, and why you might be interested in today's program. That really helps us today. And so Steve just has a one-question poll. If you are interested in submitting your responses, we'll collate those and see the types of folks that are here today, and perhaps there are folks as captured by other that aren't, captured by those labels. And in addition, we'll ask you to feel free to use the chat function in Zoom. All of us are well versed in that by now, of course, but we are interested, all of us, in your what you're most interested in related to our topic today of tribal entrepreneurship and thinking about economic development and opportunities in and around Indian country, and also interested in any questions that you have. So especially our panelists are keen to answer those. So feel free to use the chat, and Steve Isaacs will help us to monitor that, and we'll leave some time for Q&A, of course. And lastly, as we get started, I want to be sure on behalf of UNLV to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of the region of Nevada. We know that in a virtual community, we're coming to this from lands and places all across the US or perhaps beyond. And we recognize that the University of Nevada, Las Vegas is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. And we offer our gratitude, sincere gratitude, for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in the community with this land. And so that would be the case for where those of us are beaming in from virtual worlds all across the US and beyond, recognizing the stewardship of this land. So thank you. So I'm Steve Light. As we get started then, a brief introduction here of our panelists and our topic. And we'll be going for just over an hour after that. This is an exciting topic. Tribal economies on reservation and off continue to grow and diversify. While a lot of the spotlight is often on the $40 billion plus gaming industry of more than 500 casino operations owned and operated by over 280 sovereign tribes in 29 states, there is much, much, much in terms of the rich diversification of tribal economies that's been ongoing, and thinking about business opportunities and jobs and services and community development in lots of different ways. According to the most recent census, Indigenous Americans comprise about 2.1% or so self-identified of the US population. But at least through that census, in terms of businesses owned and operated by Indigenous Americans, nearly 25,000 businesses, or just over 6% of all US businesses. So some great things are happening that far outstrip the population numbers. While there might be disparate challenges or opportunities that face many Indigenous American entrepreneurs, ranging from financing, loans, seed money, capital, infrastructure, land ownership, workforce development, or of course the rules and regulations, the rules of the road, if you will, there are great things happening. As Tribal Business News documented in profiles in 2023, there are inspiring entrepreneurs who are making waves all over the place, from innovative fashion and retail, native film production, unique bakery ventures, blacksmithing, tour companies, hospitality, beverage brands, ready-made Indigenous cuisine, and a banking startup, one or more financial institutions with a mission to serve Indigenous communities. Indigenous entrepreneurs are doing things, they're filling needs, they're finding niches, they're doing well and doing good, often at the same time. So with that in mind, we have this great topic and an exciting and distinguished panel to help us look at these kinds of successes and challenges, as well as needs and opportunities in tribal entrepreneurship. Brief introductions. And then we'll turn it over to our panelists to do a little bit more to tell us about their connection to the topic and share what they're interested in. First, in alphabetical order, we have Dr. Richard Luarkie, who is the CEO of the Emerging Equities Solutions Group and former governor for the Pueblo of Laguna. Dr. Luarkie is a visionary leader with an impressive track record spanning over 2 decades in economic and business development leadership roles throughout Indian country. He's honed his skills as a dynamic entrepreneur, a recognized tribal leader, and a strategic thinker. Dr. Luarkie's experience as a competitor analyst and business development executive has provided him with the tools to be creative and impactful with business capture strategy, business development, tech transfer, and commercialization approaches, as well as business diversification. He's embraced public leadership roles in his home tribe, as evidenced by his service as the 2-term governor for the Pueblo of Laguna, and has made invaluable contributions to many local and national boards and committees, including the Board of Trustees for the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. So we have first Governor and Dr. Luarkie. I'll continue forward and then we'll hear from each individual, but hello to Dr. Luarkie. We also have the Honorable John Oceguera, Chief Strategy Officer for Strategies 360 and former Speaker of the Nevada Assembly. Speaker Oceguera formerly served as the Speaker for the Nevada Assembly, was an elected representative in the Nevada legislature for 12 years, and has held a variety of leadership positions and chaired numerous committees in that role, including commerce, labor, and transportation. In addition, Speaker Oceguera had a 20-year career with the Northwest Los Angeles Fire Department, working as a firefighter, a paramedic, engineer, captain, battalion chief, and retiring as assistant chief in 2011. He's also served on numerous boards and in many different leadership positions, has been named Elected Official of the Year by the American Heart Association and the National Association of Social Workers in the Nevada chapter. He's also received a Top 40 Under 40 award from In Business Las Vegas and was named Consumer Advocate of the Year by the Nevada Trial Lawyers. So again, we'll be hearing from Speaker Oceguera in just a moment, but hello. And we also have with us Maria Perez Avilez, Esquire, who is a solo law practitioner and small business owner of the Avilez law firm. Attorney Maria Perez Avilez is the owner of Avilez Law for the past 17 years. She is a member of the Taos Pueblo, a mom of 3, a wife of 1, and has been raised in Las Vegas, Nevada by her parents. And I should note she has shared this lovely introduction and has allowed me to share it with you all, these wonderful words. Raised in Las Vegas, Nevada by Frank Perez and Margaret Lujan Perez, both of whom have now walked on. Attorney Avilez has been admitted to practice in Nevada and federal courts since 2000. She's a 1991 Valley High School graduate, went on to earn her undergraduate dual degree in psychology and Spanish from Claremont McKenna in 1995, interned multiple summers and was hired on staff for the Council of Energy Resources Tribes, where she worked for 2 years, and was a part of the education and facilitation delivery programs. Attorney Avilez began her law training as an alum of the 1997 Pre-Law Summer Institute at the University of New Mexico, and is a graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law, and will be bringing her perspective as a solo practitioner as well. So we will hear from you just a moment as well, Attorney Avilez, but our greetings to you. So as you can tell, we have a tremendous panel and we better get to them. Steve Isaacs, I'm not sure if we've closed the poll, but you certainly can at whatever point you wish and maybe collate those numbers and see who we have in our audience with us today. And it looks like we have instantaneous numbers, which is fantastic. About a third of the folks have self-identified as law practitioners. We have around the same number, around 7% or so, who are tribal officials, individuals seeking to start a business as entrepreneurs. We also have a lot of folks with an academic interest in this, and then some others as well. So we're happy to know about the diversity of our audience. Thank you all for sharing that. So we'll try and speak to a diverse audience today and share everything we need to know. So what I'd like to do first is to turn it over to our panelists, and I will drop off to the background here as we hear from each panelist. And I ask, we have a wonderful introduction for each of you, but feel free to let us know a little bit more about yourselves. And in particular, if you would share your relationship to today's topic, why you're interested in entrepreneurship, or why you're passionate about it, what you've seen or experienced in or around tribal communities or reservation communities or beyond. And we'll certainly have other questions along the way to take us to places we need to go for practical tips and takeaways. So with that, without making this too inventive, I think we'll go in reverse order first. And so if Attorney Avilez would be willing to start us out, we'd love to hear from you, and feel free to share your thoughts.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be asked to speak. I am so excited about the INGG program at UNLV. It is amazing that a tribe has been so generous to include UNLV in gifting and financing the program there. It makes me very excited as a local Las Vegan, and incredibly excited being a tribal member who at the core of what I do is, how can I provide service to my community? And my community can be defined a lot of different ways. So my background in getting my education, I was working with many tribes throughout the United States, facilitating meetings where the tribes defined what would be discussed, and the process of facilitation was one that the Council of Energy Resource Tribes invested in, bringing young people in to learn a facilitation method and just to help have conversations within tribal communities. Leslie Jackson still continues with Indigenous collaborations, no longer a part of CERT, and she and her husband, Paul Caboti, continue on with Indigenous collaborations. And being able to go to so many tribes in the short time that I worked for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, it seemed to me that a lot of movers and shakers within communities where they were making huge changes or trying to honor the past in modern ways, there were a lot of attorneys, a lot of law-trained people, and that's what inspired me to become an attorney. This idea of becoming an entrepreneur, I definitely don't think of myself as an entrepreneur, even though I own my own business. It is a way to provide for myself and my family, and to contribute to the community where I live. And when I look at my own tribe, which is Taos Pueblo, trying to answer that question of how can I give back to my tribal community is one that's just an ongoing question that I try to answer. And the way that I give back to tribal people is doing pro bono work within the tribal courts within Nevada, because that's something that's easily attainable for me. In thinking about, and especially people who are looking at law, their legal education and what skills can they hone and bring back, I think law is fantastic, as long as you have an open mind to develop a skill and then give back, for sure. We have to ask, how can we continue each day walking with integrity, serving our community, serving our clients? And that's something that I definitely try to do, while balancing that with all the things I never thought I had to think about, such as, how am I going to care for my family? How am I going to care for my aging parents? How am I going to make sure that everyone is clothed and fed and receiving the medical treatment that they need? And so a lot of what my life has been about is, how do I balance those things? And I am an expert in minimizing the amount of time for my profession while maximizing my family time and my carer time, because that's what was needed. And now that time has opened up since my parents have walked on and my children are growing up. And serving on today's panel and serving local Nevada tribes and doing pro bono work representing tribal members within tribal courts, that's the way I plan on giving back now. And I think starting from a view of service to community, to Native communities, I think that is the best way that I can walk forward and provide some of my skills and services. And for those who may be local, I specialize in dependency work. So if there are law students or practitioners who have any questions about that particular area of law, I'm your gal. I'm an expert in that field.
Thank you so much, Attorney Avilez. That's a wonderful statement for us, and we'll start to pick up on some themes here relation to communities and giving back. And we'll ask next Speaker Oceguera if he'd be willing to share some initial thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. You gave a longer introduction of me than I would rather hear, but I do appreciate it. Some things that kind of weren't in that introduction that I would like to focus on a little bit. One, I am also a Boyd Law School graduate. Come through it through a different path than most. You know, did the part-time program at night, mostly because, you know, my colleagues on the fire department said, firefighters can't go to law school. And I said, well, the heck they can't. Watch me. So it's kind of one of those age-old deals where someone challenged me to complete something, and I did. However, I never planned on practicing law. And whenever I talk to law school classes or groups like this, I like to say that there are other paths than just practicing law. Nothing wrong with that, practicing law. But for me, one, in my professional career as an assistant fire chief, if you think about it, the things that I did, whether it's negotiating contracts, building fire stations, purchasing apparatus, employee disputes, you name it, every piece of that the law touched. And so it gave me a really, really good ability to read something quickly, kind of distill it, spot the issues, and make a decision quickly. Similarly, in my time in the legislature, unfortunately, I wasn't real smart about this. I decided to run for the legislature while in law school. So as we know how taxing law school can be, I was also in law school. I was also running for the legislature at the same time, and then was elected and had to run again while I was still in law school. So that made it really, really challenging. But the law training really helped me in the legislature because I was, again, able to read a statute, read a bill, and distill that down really quickly, spot the issues, and could see exactly what they were trying to do. While some people were trying to read every single word, I was able to kind of figure it out pretty quickly what the path was. So, like was stated, I retired from the fire department, and I thought I was just going to be retired. I had finished out the legislature, and a fellow came to town who was starting a lobbying business, or wanted to start a lobbying business in Nevada. Had you asked me when I was in the legislature if I was going to lobby when I was out of the legislature, I would have told you were crazy. And this gentleman came and had offices in 5 or 6 different states and said, I'd like to start a practice in Nevada, and I want you to look at these couple people and tell me what you think about them. And I said, okay. And I gave him my advice, sent him on his way. And a couple of days later, he came back and he said, I think you were right on that. I like that guy. I like this guy. This woman's wonderful. What do you think about that? But what are you doing? Was his last statement. And I said, I'm good. I'm retired. the next thing you know, it's 10 years later, and I've been working for that firm, and I've moved up in the ranks there, and I think I'm the fourth most senior guy there. Part of my background also is I'm a citizen of the Walker River Paiute Nation. I grew up in northern Nevada between the communities of Fallon and Schurz, Nevada. If any of you are around here, you might recognize some of those communities. And I always had the desire to give back to my community. I was through my public service, both in the legislature and on the fire department. But then in my career, I saw the opportunity to help tribes. So in our lobbying profession, we have a half a dozen tribes that we represent currently. And that's really the intersection generally what a lobbyist does is the intersection between business and government. However, in this case, because our nations are sovereign, it's a government to government relationship. And sometimes tribes don't exercise that ability to work with other local, state, federal governments to the greatest extent. And what I have helped these tribes do on the economic development side is do things like put a Walmart on a reservation, put a fuel station on a reservation, open up cannabis facilities on a reservation. So I come at this from a kind of more of an economic development than I do from the entrepreneur. Although I would call our, my business an entrepreneurial business, and finding new clients every day is business development and entrepreneurial in itself. But what I can offer here in this discussion as we move through is that intersection between government and why that's so important. So I'll leave it there, and that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thank you so much, Speaker Oceguera. And so we'll put a pin in the idea of looking at the intersections of business and government, and maybe exploring how that might come out in relationship to a legal or regulatory environment that could be made favorable to or more favorable to economic development and entrepreneurship in and around reservation communities. And so next we'd ask Dr. Luarkie to feel free to introduce himself, to talk a little bit about background and his relationship to our topic today.
Well, thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. And with respect to everyone, just wanted to acknowledge everyone and our creator that is allowing us to all be here in a good way, and I'm sure our creator is happy, and I hope our elders, our children, those that are overseas are well and experiencing a peaceful moment as we are as well. So I just wanted to open with those words. Thank you for allowing me to participate with all of you this afternoon. As you've heard in the introduction, some of the roles I've had the opportunity to serve in. I've grown up in the majority of my life in the Pueblo of Laguna. My grandparents raised me there, so I've had the opportunity to participate, on the community side, the traditional side, as well as the economic side. My schooling was primarily done there, except when I went away to college and those kind of things. And where I really cut my teeth in the economic side was in federal contracting, and business development and those kind of things. So we had a couple companies that played in that space of federal contracting, defense contracting, and those spaces. So that's where I started to get exposed to this area of economic or business development, economic development, which I'll touch on in a bit, which I believe are different, and how I believe, in this next generation or this next era, economy building, it really is going to require collaboration. It's going to require a different thought process and the way we look at things and building out our economies, and most importantly, leveraging the talent in our economies or in our communities. So you know, with that said, you know, I when I look at things, and having again had that chance to serve on the tribal side, I see many of our tribes, we behave, the analogy I would use is we're analogous to China. The government owns everything. The government owns the businesses, you know, the major revenue generators. And so the private sector is usually snuffed out, or we don't have the ability to grow the companies, our private sector businesses, the way we could. So a lot of our tribal members leave and they're doing their businesses in the town down the road or wherever else. I don't know of any major tribal member owned business that's headquartered on tribal lands. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. I'm just not aware of them. So those are going to be really, really important things that I think you all as attorneys, and I saw a couple of tribal leaders on the call here, that I think we really need to be thinking about. You know, when you again look at it through the lens of the tribal leader, we use infrastructure and structures that were handed down to us, whether they're advantageous to us or not. And one of the things I think about is the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, in particular, Section 17, federally chartered corporations, right? Federally chartered corporations, they can be an incredible power tool because they got treatment as a tribe, they're tax exempt, yet they're for profit, and they can behave like any private sector commercial business. So for profit and tax exempt in the same equation normally doesn't happen. The problem with it, though, is that the council, i.e. the shareholder, controls that operation. So you almost have a paternalistic situation, whether it's conscious or not. And when you're in a shareholder meeting, the shareholder, i.e. the tribal council, doesn't think like a shareholder. They're still thinking like a tribal council member. They're thinking like, how do we get our budget bigger and how do we spend it? Versus a shareholder, how do we build our balance sheet? How do we build our assets? Right? So I think we're at a time where we got to be strategic and mindful of how we look at how we structure our businesses going forward. I think that's really, really critical. And why I think this is important is I would actually advocate more for a tribal corporation under tribal law. You can be more agile. I mean, you look at organizations like Ho Chunk Inc. You know, everybody else refers to Ho Chunk, but there's many others. You look at Southern Ute, multi-billion-dollar tribes, revenue generating. And that different structure allows you to be more agile, more flexible. But what if you also apply that to tribal members, tribal member-owned businesses, being able to incorporate under tribal law, tribal ordinance as a tribal corporation, maybe with a small percentage, because it doesn't require any particular percentage of tribal ownership in a tribal corporation. Whereas the Section 17, it has to 100% be owned by the tribe. So this creates a unique dimension or dynamic in building the tribal economy, because we tend to think about our tribal economies almost geofenced. Our tribal economy is defined by our reservation boundary. Economies don't work that way, right? And so, especially now with technology in the digital world, you can have a customer in China. You can have a customer in Norway, right? So I would encourage that, you know, as you look at from a legal lens, and even policy, how we create, how we use existing laws and technology or policies to be able to build out our economies in this next generation. I think that is so very important, so that we don't unconsciously continue, or we don't unconsciously perpetuate some of those laws and policies that either slow down our growth or make us less competitive as a business side. I'm not sure how I did that, sorry. Thumbs up. But you know, those are things that I think we need to really think about. The other piece I would just throw out here is when I look at our tribes here in the Southwest, in particular, I look at Chaco Canyon as a reference point for history. They tell us, our elders, our ancestors, tell us about our ancestors and how they figured out the solstice. You know, many of you have probably seen that sun symbol that is there at Chaco Canyon, and it's in many graphics and those kind of things. But that's how they track the moon and the sun, and ultimately resulting in their understanding the solstice. But we know today the moon and the sun go in 9-year cycles. So it wasn't a couple guys sitting down over a weekend with a 6-pack of beer and figured it out, right? You know, so it was probably a generation or two that monitored that. So why I share that example is that that's one of the, at least in my mind, one of the first and many examples of Native America using data analytics. But it's also an example of the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. The reason I share that is in building our economies, building our businesses, we come from a long line of genius. We come from a long line of intellect. To me, when I think about culture, we have a culture of intellect, a culture of genius that should be applied to our business models, that should be applied to the service or product or strategy we put together. Hire me because I kick ass, not because I'm Indian. The Indian part is a bonus. So I would share that, right, you know, in thinking about that going forward. And lastly here, you know, I would also say when on the tribal government side, we do a lot of planning, but many of those plans, and the tribal leaders on the call might have similar experiences, but you know, many of those plans are beautifully done, well researched, then they sit on the shelf. They never get implemented. They don't get executed. And so I use that as a way to also introduce the difference between economic development and business development. In my mind, economic development, that's a government function, whether it's tribal or state or federal. And why I say that, economic development is about creating your policies and your ordinances and your laws and your taxes that will incentivize business to move to your area or be conducted in your area. It's your roads, it's your infrastructure, it's your housing, it's your healthcare, it's your education system. And the government wants as many jobs to come out of economic development. Business development is about the market, creating revenue, creating innovations and executing and implementing. The government runs to a budget. Businesses run to a profit or loss. Very different mindsets. And so, but they need each other. The rules and the conditions for success have to be created here. And then these guys know how to execute. So I think those become very, very important partners in creating an economy. And so I think as we go forward, tribes and and individuals like you all on the pod here today really need to be thinking about how we reimagine our economic future. You know, we're at a place in time now where I would think about it in terms of three pillars, right? You know, there's the government, there's education or economics, and then there's community. Years past, community had a good voice in how we go forward as tribes. Right now, maybe it's because of gaming or I don't know, but the tribal government gets the revenue from the businesses they own, the larger businesses, again, whether it's gaming, whatever it is, they get the large revenue. All that money comes to the tribal government, but normally that wealth doesn't get distributed into the community other than through services or programs. There's not investments typically in businesses. The business gets attention from the government because that's who feeds them. So those become the partners, if you will, but then the community gets the leftovers. So I think it's really important that we re-engage community as that third pillar because, and I've said it in my own tribal council when I was serving as governor, the innovators don't sit in the tribal council. The innovators are in our community. When you're sitting there with a tribal leader hat, you like to think you're the innovators, but we're not. They're in the community. And we got to invest in our people. We have to invest in our community. So I would just go that far and you know, share that I think being involved in the entrepreneurial side and the business side and the economic side is, you know, those are the reasons why I'm interested. I think we have a culture of our culture of genius and intelligence. We have our culture can be a competitive edge. Our culture sometimes though is a hindrance. But I think our culture can be a competitive edge, you know, going forward and building economies. So I'll go that far, Steve, and see if there's any other comments or questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luarkie. And so we have some themes. I've been taking a few notes that are starting to emerge. And again, want to say that anyone in the audience can feel free to drop a question in the chat. I know that our panelists might be interested in the opportunity to speak to one another a little bit about some of these initial comments or some themes or some ideas or to engage. I have some possible questions as well, some prompts to think about, but want to create some space for our panelists to speak to one another. So among the themes that we've heard about are, is there a useful distinction to be made between economic development and entrepreneurship or business development? And if so, what is the usefulness of that distinction in tribal economies? We might think about, is there even a need for a private sector in tribal economies? That's a provocative question. So you know, we've heard some conversation about that. The role of those who are in public office, tribal officials, let's say, in creating conditions that might be the necessary ones for success versus the role of the individuals in the business sector or entrepreneurs themselves. The importance or significance of speaking to the community or doing something for the good of the community and where that fits within business development. And then I'll be able to circle back to some other ideas as well, but want to turn it to our panelists. Would you like to speak to each other about one or more of those themes? And maybe, yes, so fantastic. Please go ahead.
Well, a couple things. One, just in answering out loud, and we'll see if the other panelists agree, but I definitely think that there is a role for the private sector in tribal businesses. As an example, you know, tribes didn't know a lot about gaming. It made sense to have a gaming operator come in and kind of start that process. What I would say, similarly in cannabis, right? We didn't have operators in the cannabis space that were on tribal lands. They were folks that were coming from the private sector. What I would say though is when I look for those operators to come in, I look for operators who want to come in and train our people, let them get the knowledge, experience, education, if that is what is required, to then take over those businesses. So I think there is a real role for the private sector. Not to say that we aren't capable. We are absolutely capable, but why reinvent the wheel? Why not have somebody come in, teach you up, learn you up, get you moving, and then they can slowly fade back to the private sector side. So in an answer to one of your questions, that's one of the things I would say. And then two, kind of a question for the panelists, and I always see this, right? One, for the attorneys, the role of government affairs. Do you see that, you know, a lot of times in the legal profession, we're just banging our head against the wall as far as a result that continues to happen. And I feel like there should be a school or a class in law school about government affairs and changing the law. The only way to change the law is not to get a decision from a judge. You can go to your state legislature and change the law. So that's, I guess, towards my attorney friends. And then towards the governor, similarly, I find that tribal governments kind of miss that step sometimes too. They don't realize that they can make it advantageous for the tribe at the state level or at the local level or at the federal level. And a lot of tribes miss that. So throw out those two more, see if that sparks anything.
I would add to John's comments, in the roles, again, when you look at it from the tribal leadership side, and as in particular to the federally recognized tribes, our relationships with the federal government, not necessarily with the state, but we have to work with the state, right? I mean, and in particular to New Mexico, the gaming compacts, so that is an example. Personal income tax here for tribal or for non-tribal members that work for a tribe all go to the state. The tribe gets zero of that. So yet, we're both sovereigns, and the Constitution says, we're both domestic dependent sovereigns, yet one gets subordinated, and those are the tribes here in New Mexico when it comes to taxation. So I think John is absolutely right, and one of the things we did, I worked for the Pueblo of Santa Ana for about 4.5 years, and one of the things we did there, under our team, we brought in Tesla up there. And Tesla's business model is not the dealership model, it's retail. So they sell directly to the consumer. And the dealership laws here in New Mexico would not allow for that to happen. However, that law does not apply to sovereign lands, to tribal lands. So we put Tesla on Santa Ana land, but we went a step further, going to what John's point is. We worked with the state legislature during the legislative session year before and changed state statute on taxation. So now when a Tesla is sold here in New Mexico or is picked up at that dealership, the sales tax goes to the Pueblo of Santa Ana 100%, not to the state of New Mexico. To me, that's the win. It's not the Tesla piece. The win was changing statute, because now they have a long-term revenue source.
Terrific response, and some great concrete example too. I know our participants will love to hear about some of those examples and get them thinking about what are the prospects for, let's say, law reform, or for incentive structures or tax structures or financing structures that can encourage business development. And so appreciate that, Governor Luarkie, for giving us that example. Attorney Avilez, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to respond to directly, and then I might have a question that would start with you after that.
I do see economic development and entrepreneurship as two very different things. When I think to my own tribe, and I think about it as an entrepreneur, did I even consider taking the New Mexico bar instead of Nevada, so that I could go back to my tribe, open my business there in Taos Pueblo, or in the surrounding area? And I will tell you, absolutely not. That didn't cross my mind. And why not? Well, there is a level of understanding and predictability that I, as a business person, need. And were there written laws? Were there statutes? Is there code that I could look to and say, okay, I can safely open my business here. I understand what the implications are going to be for me as a member of the tribe, as a person who's living in New Mexico. For those were all unknowns to me as a business person. And so that was not going to be an acceptable risk to me as a business owner moving forward. And especially because I was a little business owner who had no idea what I was doing in practicing law in the first place, right? So I'm a newly licensed attorney, and I'm going to take on whether or not my tribe has a set of laws, rules, regulations that I can follow. Did it even exist at that time? And so each tribe is in varying stages of how they want to interact with themselves, how they govern themselves. But in addition, that entrepreneurship piece, is there someone, is the council within the tribe, are they wanting that kind of expansion? Do they want businesses run out of their jurisdiction? Is that something that they want to encourage with their tribal membership or non-tribal membership? And so that predictability factor for me as a new business owner was not there, and so was not something that I would even have considered at that point. Coming back to the issue of economic development, I am very proud of how my tribe is moving forward, and they have multiple different businesses that are coming online and that are online. And we have entrepreneurs that are tribal members, and Bison Star Naturals is the first one that I think of, and I hope one day to see Bison Star Naturals and many of the businesses that we see, such as in like the place I stayed last night, the Marriott businesses. I don't know why tribal Bison Star Naturals isn't there. It has the best line of soaps and lotions, and I think that's something that everybody uses. So has there been changes? Is there more acceptance to allow entrepreneurship maybe back in my home tribe? Absolutely. Am I the person that can get that done? No, I don't feel that I am, but I need to serve communities where I'm at and be proud of and support my fellow tribal members. And I sit here today very proud of a lot of the tribal professionals and tribal members who are moving forward and facing that uncertainty with my own tribe.
Thank you very much for that response. And what that helps us to tee up here as we're sort of pivoting into the next phase of our conversation and being mindful of time as well for questions that would come in. I wanted to ask our panelists, each of you has introduced at least one variable or factor that would contribute to the success of innovation, of entrepreneurs, of business development. And so I want to come back to that and see what else you all would want to talk about as sort of practical tips or takeaways for those in our audience. What are the conditions for success for entrepreneurs and innovators in or around reservation economies or for tribes. We've heard, for example, Attorney Avilez just talked about the need for certainty or greater certainty or removal of uncertainty for small businesses and the idea of mitigating risk. So are there some other examples that we could learn from, especially for, we have tribal officials in the audience and also practitioners and those who are interested in getting into business? What helps set up the conditions for success? Could I start with, without wanting to put anyone on the spot, but just to keep things moving forward, Speaker Oceguera, would you have any thoughts on that? And if not, you can pass.
Can I phone a friend? No. Yeah, a couple things. One, just on advice, right? Like, you're going to get told no a lot. And don't ever take no for an answer, right? Don't take no for the answer. Try to figure out the way, right? There's always a path to get to yes. And so I think a lot of times folks just give up when they are, run up against a roadblock. And I just would encourage everyone, never take that first no as the final answer. I was going to just give an example of one of the tribes I've worked with. Really, really smart in what they did. They had a piece of property where we had put a Walmart on, and there was some property adjacent to that that was not in trust and it was not tribal land, that we saw an opportunity there to do some economic development that would be in conjunction with this Walmart facility that we had put in. However, we didn't own that, so we had to think of a way that we weren't going to be able to just purchase that property. So what we did was, the state had a need. Their need was for a transitional housing facility for the prison system. We happened to have a piece of land that they were eyeing for that. So what we did was we built that facility, turnkey, soup to nuts, handed the state the keys. In turn, they gave us this piece of land, and that we really wanted, right? Like, so my point in all that is, there's again, to not taking no for an answer, there's always a way to facilitate a win. And that was a win for everybody. The state really needed this facility. They couldn't get it done in a timely manner. It was going to take multiple years for them to do it. On tribal land, we could get it done really quickly, and we did. And we just handed them the keys for that facility. The state was ecstatic and said, "You want that piece of land? Sure, it's yours." And on we went. So being innovative, not taking no for an answer, some of the things that I would say off the top of my head.
And it sounds like as well, you're highlighting the importance of looking for and building partnerships. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's something that sounds like a kind of duh sort of answer, but I think we'd want to highlight that here, and I'm certainly hearing that from each of you. It can be partnerships with tribal officials. It can be sort of internal. It can be partnerships that are externally focused. I know with your position in the Nevada legislature, I assume building bridges was incredibly important and significant. And then looking for those win-win-win kind of outcomes we're hearing.
I'm sorry, just one more partnership on almost the same deal on that Walmart. Walmart didn't necessarily want to put a facility on the reservation where it was. But what we did there was we contributed every year 1% of the tax revenue back to the school district, because our children aren't going to school in this particular reservation. On the reservation, they're going to that school district. So each year we hand back a check for somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million to the school district for the privilege, of you will, of having this Walmart. And then again, another win-win, right? Okay, yeah, that sounds great. We can have that facility there. And by the way, our students get, you know, a significant amount of money into the school district.
Fantastic. Another great example on thinking about creativity and looking at where the dollars might flow in those kind of partnerships and win-win-win outcomes. Let's turn to, if we could, to Dr. Luarkie, or Governor Luarkie. And so again, what's on the table here is finding the conditions for success or creating the conditions for success. Thoughts or tips? I know you've already shared some.
Well, you know, I think from again, if I throw on my former tribal leader hat, you know, in those roles, you learn a lot about the law, just because of all the issues you have to deal with. But I think what that knowledge also gives you is, you know, or at least from a tribal side, is the ability to have an insight of what we shouldn't do. You know, and so that's real important. I think, you know, when we look at those conditions for success, typically in any market, there's barriers to entry. And those barriers to entry are usually cost factors. It's cost prohibitive. Maybe it's equipment. Maybe it's just a complex market. Those kind of things are typical barriers to entry. But in tribal communities, sometimes that barrier to entry is skepticism. The tribal leadership saying, how come that tribal member and not this one? Or how come, you know? So I think we have to get to that place of being able to be inspired by our tribal members and encourage them and invest in them. You know, and I always say, you know one tribe, you know one tribe. We're all different. So I'm not putting a blanket or just one big stroke across all tribes. You know, we're all different. And so, but I think in a local tribal economy, private sector building, that's one of the things that we have to really think about versus looking at our people through the lens of skepticism. We need to look at them through the lens of opportunity and innovation and how we invest in them. The other piece of this is a systems update, you know, or structural update. You know, I think a lot of the metrics and demographics we look at in Indian country is the poverty or the housing rate or lack of housing or education rates or whatnot. To me, that's kind of an individual level versus thinking about the system. What kind of system do we have there? You know, so one example I would give is the tribal government itself. Most tribal governments, you know, have very short terms, and they tend to plan around their term versus the long view. So you got administrations that serve for 1 year, and really it's maybe 9 months, because the first month and a half they're just trying to figure out which way is right, which way is left. Then the last 2 months or month and a half they're shutting down. So even a 2-year term is short. So I think structurally, you know, there's going to have to be some things to be reconsidered by tribes going forward, because, you know, governments aren't structured, or governments, their purpose isn't solely for business or economic development, right? But they're enablers of it. And I think to Attorney Avilez's comment, you know, the ability to support, like she gave the example in Taos, how can you help support that, right? I think that's really, really important. And I guess the last thing I would say is, you know, collaboration is so important, whether it's at the individual level or at, you know, the business level or tribal government level. You know, when I had the opportunity to serve as governor, you know, I sat in many meetings, whether it's locally, regionally, national meetings. You hear it a lot, like meetings at the National Congress of American Indians or wherever. We have to work together. We have to be one. You know, here locally, we have the 19 Pueblo governors, all Pueblo Council governors, and we meet every year up in January. We kick off the year with all the governors being there and pledging our allegiance to one another and unity and working as one. right? But when it comes to dancing to that song, we have two left feet. We have to get better at working together, you know, and so we shouldn't be afraid of each other, you know, and so I think those are gonna be, to me, breaking down those barriers of entry will help expedite and advance the conditions for success for economics, you know, and those are things that are gonna have to happen. Like I said, every tribe's different. And they're gonna have to make that assessment of what does that mean to them. And some tribes may not want it, and that's okay. You know, but there's others that have all the resources, have the opportunity. But just because you have resources, I know some tribes that generate an incredible amount of resource, but they can't advance any further because the political structure just gets in the way. You know, so, and then you have other tribes that are making really good progress, albeit they may not be the billion-dollar tribe, but it's because they have a stable infrastructure. They have a stable system. So I those are the things that I would throw out, you know, as ways to think about our conditions for success and inspiring our people and recognizing the innovators in our community and not snuffing them out, but encouraging them and creating the policies and ordinances that are not restrictive, but are actually enabling in our communities.
Thank you so much. And so one takeaway there is, you know, we often think about audit in terms of just numbers in the business environment. But what you're talking about is really, as you put it, a systems or structures audit, or if you will, a law and policy audit within a given community about what are the structures or systems that either hinder business development and innovation or help business development and innovation, move away from or restructure in one direction and encourage and put in place the systems and structures that help in the other direction. So that idea of audit. Keeping, again, an eye on the time, we want to turn to Attorney Avilez. Same question, and then I'll circle back for some Q&A just quickly. So Attorney Avilez, any thoughts on conditions for success, whether that's legal or otherwise?
A condition for success that at least I face, and I'm the only female on the panel today, but traditionally, my understanding from my tribe is my role as a carer is one that I certainly wasn't trained for. The huge amount of time, dedication, sweat equity that went into being a parent and caring for my elderly parents, being in part of that sandwich generation. And having skills and knowledge that are non-traditional skills, where I was able to receive my formalized non-Indian education. Our biggest resource are our tribal members, and maybe they get a benefit, those that are raised in urban areas, to programs within their cities, but that doesn't mean that our tribal governments necessarily accept them back into the traditional society. And so figuring out how can we manage and capitalize on students who are getting their educations in fields that can benefit our communities. How do we do it in a way that is new and acceptable, that we want to use a resource, our natural resource, instead of, and I truly believe that the success story that I am seeing from the federal government side of it is we're going to label people percentages of blood quantum, and each tribal government gets to decide if it's ancestry that are tribal members or blood quantum. The goal of that system was to make sure that tribes become extinct. And so tribes that have now created ongoing systems where they want to take advantage and include encourage tribal membership and grow tribal members to continue on as governments versus those tribes who want to restrict and eliminate. So I think the biggest natural resource, if I could have a wand and I wanted to change something about my own life and my own tribal membership and participation, it's how do we integrate urban natives back into healthy members of our local governments? What can they bring to assist? But also, how can we teach them in a way that is still respectful to the culture?
Thank you. That's really insightful, and thinking about, as you put it, the greatest natural resource of people, and thinking of people and individuals and populations, skill sets, diversity of what individuals can contribute, and how to leverage that resource towards success. That's fantastic. We know we only have a few minutes left here. Certainly invite, I'm not sure, Steve Isaacs, if any questions have come in, but we have a moment or two for questions from our panelists as we bring things to a close. Any questions that we've received, or anyone want to ask a question?
There hasn't been a question into the chat or anything, but if anyone has any right now, please raise your hand, or however Steve you want to do, if you want to call them with their hand raised, or.
Well, I think, yeah, I appreciate that, Steve. So we just have our last couple minutes, and so if anyone does have a question for our panelists, if you can type that into the chat, we'll try and answer that. Otherwise, I'll put, or in addition, while that's happening, we all wanted to be sure to leave folks with practical tips and takeaways, and I think we've already heard some of them. But I want to give each panelist an opportunity for a last word on a practical tip or takeaway. Or as Attorney Avilez said, if you could wave a magic wand, alternately, what would you do? So, and our theme is business development, entrepreneurs, ready, go. So who would like to start with a practical tip or takeaway?
My practical tip or takeaway that I would offer to everyone, my specialization again is independency. If you have family members who are facing the state having taken your children, and you need an amazing defense attorney for a parent or a guardian, please reach out to me. I definitely love advocating in court, but my favorite thing in the whole wide world is battle in court. So please reach out to me there. And also, I just wanted everyone to know, one of the things that I try to make sure that I do is when I see other Native professionals out there, I am a cheerleader. I am not someone who's jealous or wants to tear down, but I want to lift all of us up. And so if I can be a part in that, or you come through Vegas and want to meet up for dinner, my door is always open.
Fantastic, thank you. And what we can also take away in addition there, what we're hearing is the importance and significance from each of our panelists of guidance and expertise, whether that's legal or business savvy or those with connections or otherwise. I'm going to jump in the middle because we do have a question here, whether there are efforts that we know of to support the creation of wealth for individuals or families, or supports for the development of online businesses and services. A remarkable question, thank you. And again, we only have a moment or two. Is there someone who feels that they can respond or would like to respond to that? Wealth creation, online or otherwise?
I guess, one of the things I would say, if you're if you're living on tribal lands, and this is where again it gets difficult for the creation of wealth, right? Because one of the biggest things that contributes to wealth is land ownership. We can't own land, and so that's one of your biggest assets. So that's a challenge. Now it's just financial. if it's just, maybe tribes per capita or something. I mean, there's some tribes that are doing, some investments for, that for their people that, give them financial training before their young people get their money and all those kind of things, and different models around that. But I think true wealth really, if it's from a financial side, also, you need to build assets. And that's really hard to do on tribal land. So, the HARP Act, I think, is a step in that direction in trying to build wealth for tribal members. But, the minute the tribe puts land into trust, it turns into a big fat zero on the balance sheet, right? Because the government owns it now. So that's not even an asset for the tribe. So I think those are things that need to be considered. Now on the support for development of online businesses and services, I personally don't know of any write-off. But I think those are all truly entrepreneurial, people having their online stores, or getting a Amazon sales web page or whatever it's called, to sell their crafts or whatever they sell. But I'm not aware of any tribally supported models that support entrepreneurs on the online business side.
Thank you, Governor Luarkie. It's an excellent question because, of course, we know the digital space is where so many things have already migrated, services, products, and so forth. And so that may be an open question for us and an important one as we're thinking of closing today, nevertheless, an important one to consider. Forgive me because we're closing on time. And so I'd like to give Speaker Oceguera an opportunity to say one final thing, if you want, any suggestion or recommendation, and then we'll do a little housekeeping to close.
I would just reiterate what I said about never taking no for an answer, never giving up. And then in addition, I think the point made about mentoring and helping others, lifting them up. I'm always struck by the folks who have interned or externed or have worked for me in various positions, are now really doing great things. And I'd like to think I had just a little smidge of something to do with that, but it is a great network when you lift people up, because they're all willing to help you when you need help as well. It's not the reason to do it, but that has come around for sure.
Thank you. And that is an excellent tip for us as well, to recall that whether it's our students in the next generations of law practitioners, or those who will be entering business or government or nonprofit sector, those who will be helping their communities and seeking to serve in different ways, those who will be seeking to leverage and make profit. Whatever the case is, the next generations are the ones that we're teaching now and encouraging. And that's one of the main roles and purposes of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance program at Boyd School of Law as well, is to help equip those students with the tools they need. That includes building networks. And so we hope that that's one important outcome from our conversation today. We don't want, I know our panelists don't want the conversation to end just because our time is up. We want to encourage folks to be in contact with one another, or to look for those networking opportunities. And so let us thank each of our three panelists for an excellent conversation and excellent insights today, and really appreciate all your time and talent that you've given us. Thank you for the excellent question that came in online. Thank you also to the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians for its generous support, Boyd School of Law. And Steve Isaacs, is there any last housekeeping as we close in terms of sharing contacts or anything else?
Yes, so later today, at some point, we'll be sending out just a Google form, a Google feedback form to all of you who have, everybody in the audience. You can get it back at your earliest convenience. We always appreciate feedback and always want to see what we did right, what we did wrong, and improve. Always looking to improve. In there, at some point within that, around the time that we'll post the YouTube video, We'll also be sending out a follow-up summary of this webinar so that you can more easily check back into what was said rather than having to watch the whole YouTube video, although you're very welcome to do that as well.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate that. With that, our thanks to each and every one of you. There's some great contact information being shared, and as Steve said, other opportunities will make sure to connect folks together. We really want to do that. We wish everyone a terrific afternoon and great good fortune. And as we are in the midst of a wonderful summer right now, hopefully not too hot in Vegas, but wherever we are, we really appreciate everyone's participation. Thank you very much and have a great day, everyone.
Certainly.